Every person reading this has lied today. Not necessarily a significant lie. Not necessarily a lie that caused harm or that you feel guilty about. Maybe it was something so minor that calling it a lie feels like an overstatement. You said you were fine when you were not. You said you liked something you did not particularly like. You said you had already eaten when you had not, or that you were almost there when you had not yet left, or that you would read the email when you had no intention of reading the email. Research on the frequency of lying in everyday life has produced remarkably consistent findings across multiple studies and multiple methodologies. The psychologist Bella DePaulo at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who has conducted some of the most systematic research on everyday lying, found in her landmark diary studies in the 1990s that people lie in approximately 1/5 of their social interactions, lasting 10 minutes or longer. That is roughly 1 to 2 lies per day for the average person. Other researchers using different methodologies have found higher figures, with some studies documenting an average of closer to 2 lies per day in laboratory settings and considerably more in naturalistic observation. But the frequency statistics, while interesting, are not the most interesting thing about lying. The most interesting thing about lying is what it requires. Because lying, properly understood, is one of the most cognitively demanding things a human being routinely does. To lie successfully, you must simultaneously hold in mind the true state of affairs and the false state of affairs you wish the other person to believe. You must model the other person's mental state, what they currently believe, and what you want them to believe. You must monitor your own behavior for signs of deception that might reveal the truth. You must maintain consistency between the lie and other things you have said and done. And you must do all of this in real time, in the middle of a social interaction, while simultaneously managing the emotional experience of deception, which for most people involves at least some degree of anxiety. This cognitive complexity is not incidental to lying. It is the key to understanding where the capacity for lying came from and what its evolution reveals about the development of the human mind. The evolutionary origins of deception are a subject that has produced some of the most fascinating and most contested research in all of behavioral science. Because lying requires theory of mind, the ability to model and reason about the mental states of others, and because theory of mind is one of the cognitive capacities most sharply differentiated between human beings and other animals, the evolution of deception is closely entangled with some of the deepest questions about what makes human cognition distinctive. Let's begin with what the comparative evidence tells us about deception in non-human animals. Deception in some form exists across a wide range of species. Certain orchid species deceive pollinating insects with flowers that mimic the appearance and scent of female insects without providing the nectar reward the pollinators are seeking. Some prey animals use mimicry to appear unpalatable or dangerous. Some predators use camouflage or lures to deceive prey. These are what evolutionary biologists call functional deception, cases in which one organism creates a false impression in another organism without any representation of the mental states involved. What appears to distinguish human deception from these cases is the intentional structure of the deception. Human lying is not simply behavior that happens to mislead. It is behavior that is deliberately designed to create a false belief in the mind of another person who would not consent to the deception if they understood what was happening. This kind of intentional deception requires the deceiver to have a model of the other person's mind, to understand that the other person has beliefs that can be true or false, and to deliberately manipulate those beliefs. The primatologist Frans de Waal at Emory University, who has spent decades studying social cognition in great apes, documented numerous cases of what he called tactical deception in chimpanzees and other great apes in his landmark 1982 book, Chimpanzee Politics. De Waal observed chimpanzees concealing erections from dominant males to avoid competition over females. He observed them suppressing fear grimaces in situations where displaying fear would invite attack from rivals. He observed them leading group members away from desired food sources and then doubling back to acquire the food alone. These behaviors have an intentional flavor that functional deception in plants and simple animals does not. The chimpanzee that conceals its erection from a dominant male appears to be doing something that requires, at minimum, some understanding of what the dominant male can see and what that male would do with the information. But whether this requires a full theory of mind in the sense that human intentional deception requires remains genuinely controversial. The developmental psychologist Michael Tomasello at Duke University, who has done more than perhaps anyone to map the cognitive differences between humans and other great apes, argues that what distinguishes human social cognition is not simply theory of mind, but a specific form of it: the ability to understand others as intentional agents with beliefs and goals that can be different from one's own and that can be deliberately manipulated. Tomasello calls this shared intentionality, and he argues that it is the cognitive foundation not just of deception, but of all distinctively human forms of cooperation, communication, and culture. The developmental evidence on the emergence of lying in human children illuminates the connection between deception and cognitive development with unusual clarity. Children begin to lie around the age of 2 to 3 years, at the same developmental period in which they show the first clear evidence of theory of mind. They begin with relatively simple lies, denying that they did something they clearly did. By around 4 years of age, most children can maintain a lie under questioning, monitoring what the questioner knows, and adjusting their story accordingly. The developmental psychologist Kang Lee at the University of Toronto has conducted the most systematic research program on lying in children and has documented a finding that most parents find counterintuitive, but that has profound implications for understanding the relationship between lying and cognitive development. Children who are better liars at a given age are also, on average, better at a range of other cognitive tasks that require executive function and theory of mind, including working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. Lee's interpretation of this finding is that lying is not a moral failure, but a cognitive achievement. The child who successfully lies at age 4 has demonstrated the ability to hold two conflicting representations in mind simultaneously, to understand the mental state of the person they are deceiving, to inhibit the natural inclination to tell the truth, and to monitor and adjust their behavior in real time. These are the same cognitive capacities that underlie a wide range of adaptive and prosocial behaviors. This does not mean that lying is good or that we should encourage children to lie. It means that the cognitive machinery that enables lying is the same cognitive machinery that enables many other distinctively human capabilities, including empathy, perspective-taking, strategic planning, and creative thinking. The evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar at Oxford University has proposed one of the most influential accounts of why the distinctively human capacity for intentional deception evolved. Dunbar's social brain hypothesis, which we have touched on in earlier videos in this series, proposes that the expansion of the human neocortex was driven primarily by the demands of social life in large, complex groups. Managing relationships in a large social group requires keeping track of who is allied with whom, who has what and wants what, whose reputation is rising and whose is falling, and how to manage one's own reputation and relationships strategically. Dunbar argues that deception was one of the primary cognitive tools that drove neocortex expansion, because successfully deceiving others in a social group and successfully detecting deception by others requires exactly the kind of sophisticated social modeling that places the heaviest demands on the neocortex. The arms race between deception and detection, Dunbar suggests, was one of the primary engines of human cognitive evolution. This hypothesis has been supported by a series of comparative studies finding that species with larger neocortices, relative to total brain volume, show higher rates of tactical deception. The correlation between neocortex size and deception frequency across primate species is one of the most robust findings in comparative cognitive neuroscience. The neuroscience of lying has become a significant research area in its own right, driven partly by interest in its forensic and clinical applications. Brain imaging studies of lying have consistently found that lying activates a network of prefrontal regions associated with executive function, inhibitory control, and working memory, regions that are among the most evolutionarily recent and most distinctively developed in humans. This activation pattern is consistent with the view that lying is fundamentally an executive function task, requiring the inhibition of true information and the generation and maintenance of false information in working memory. The cognitive neuroscientist Giorgio Ganis at Harvard Medical School has conducted some of the most detailed imaging studies of deception and found that spontaneous lies, lies generated in the moment in response to unexpected questions, activate prefrontal regions more strongly than rehearsed lies, lies that have been planned and prepared in advance. This finding suggests that the executive function demands of lying are highest when the deceiver must generate false information in real time, without the benefit of prior preparation. The psychologist Paul Ekman at the University of California, San Francisco, spent decades studying what he called microexpressions, brief, involuntary facial expressions that leak genuine emotional states even when the person is attempting to suppress them or mask them with a different expression. Ekman's research, which became the basis for the television series Lie to Me, documented that genuine emotional states produce involuntary muscle movements in the face that are extremely difficult to suppress, even for experienced deceivers, and that trained observers can detect these microexpressions with accuracy significantly above chance. Ekman's work has had significant practical influence, but it has also been extensively critiqued. Meta-analyses of the research on lie detection from behavioral cues have consistently found that trained human observers are only marginally better than chance at detecting deception, and that the confidence with which people claim to be able to detect lies is far in excess of their actual accuracy. The finding that humans are poor lie detectors despite being skilled liars is itself significant. It suggests that the deceptive capacity evolved more strongly than the detection capacity, which would be consistent with an evolutionary context in which successful deception conferred significant fitness advantages. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt at Princeton University made a different but related argument about the relationship between lying and human cognition in his celebrated 2005 essay on bullshit. Frankfurt distinguished between lying, which requires a commitment to the false as false, and bullshitting, which requires no commitment to truth or falsity at all. The bullshitter is not trying to create a false impression of reality. They are simply trying to create an impression, any impression, that serves their purposes. Frankfurt argued that bullshitting, in this sense, is actually more destructive to honest discourse than lying, because the liar at least takes truth seriously enough to try to contradict it, while the bullshitter has no regard for the truth at all. Frankfurt's distinction is relevant to contemporary discussions of misinformation, political rhetoric, and the deliberate manipulation of public discourse, domains in which the distinction between lying and bullshitting, between deliberate falsehood and indifference to truth, has become practically significant. What the science of lying ultimately reveals is something important about the relationship between deception and cognition. The capacity for intentional deception is not a corruption of an otherwise honest cognitive system. It is a feature, or perhaps a byproduct, of the cognitive architecture that enables theory of mind, perspective taking, and the sophisticated social modeling that underlies human cooperation and culture. The same capacity that enables you to create a false belief in another person's mind also enables you to understand what another person believes, to predict what they will do, to feel what they feel, to imagine how a situation looks from a perspective other than your own. Theory of mind is not divisible into its pro-social and antisocial applications. The cognitive machinery that enables empathy and the cognitive machinery that enables deception are the same machinery, operating in the service of different goals. This does not resolve the moral questions about lying. Those questions are real and important, and the fact that lying has a cognitive function does not make it morally acceptable. But it does suggest that the question of why humans lie is inseparable from the question of why humans are the kind of creatures they are. The capacity to deceive is the shadow side of the capacity to understand, and understanding that does not make lying right, but it makes the human animal considerably more interesting. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.